that being here in North Carolina, we're here to talk about law and order. We're here to talk about law enforcement, and we're here to talk about the basic fact that you all pay your taxes, they go to safe streets and safe cities. You ought to be able to enjoy the places that were built by your tax dollars. You ought to be afraid, the criminals ought to be afraid of you. You ought not be afraid of the criminals. It's very simple. And I think for too long in this country, we actually took the exact wrong approach. We told people that if you were walking down a city street and there was a crazy person over there yelling and screaming at your kids, you ought to walk to the other side of the street rather than possibly be accosted by a violent person. Well, you know what I think? I think that if a person is being violent and threatening to young children and young families, they ought to send their asses to prison instead of telling people that they got to cross the other side of the street. But we all know a couple weeks ago, and it's one of these things that got bumped out of the news because of the political assassination of Charlie Kirk. And so let me talk just a bit about that. You all know Charlie. He was a great guy. He was a great husband, a great father. He believed in two things, I think, above all else. Number one, the second most important, is he believed in political debate in the United States of America, that we ought to talk about our disagreements and not attack one another over our disagreements. And he gave his life dying for that principle. And the second thing he believed, and it was the most important, is that he wanted to be a Christian evangelist. He wanted to bring the gospel everywhere, and he saw connecting with people and debating politics as an opportunity to talk about his faith. And I think it's important to honor him by recognizing that this is a kid, and he died at 31 years old. This is a kid who every single day, he would go to these college campuses, he would talk for 3 hours with anybody about whatever they wanted to talk about, and he believed in the civic virtue of open debate. He gave his life to protect that civic virtue, and he gave his life serving that civic virtue at the highest level. He was a great guy, and his loss was the nation's loss. And Erica, we love you. Erica's his beautiful widow. And I think you all will join me in saying that what happened to Charlie was disgusting, it was unacceptable, and it is the most anti-American act of violence that we've seen in the last couple of weeks in this country. And the thing is, it actually bumped out of the news this terrible story in Charlotte. And here's the basic summary, as far as I can recall it, is you have a violent criminal who has been arrested 14 times, often for very violent offenses, who gets on a bus with an innocent young girl, 22 years old, and slits her throat, and she dies. She died because she was coming home from work. She worked at a pizzeria. She came from a beautiful family. She had a young boyfriend. She had her entire life ahead of her. And she was actually a refugee from Ukraine. So she came from a war-torn country. She sought shelter in the United States of America. And because of soft-on-crime policies, she was murdered here, not in the war-torn country she came from. Isn't that a disgrace? And isn't that an insult to the incredible law enforcement officers who arrested this person 14 times? They did everything that they could to keep this thug off the streets, and it was the political leadership that failed, and we got to be honest about that. I said Charlie Kirk's assassination was the most political and disgusting violence that we've had in this country in the last couple of weeks, and that was true maybe until this morning. Because I don't know if you all have followed the news, and we're still learning a little bit about it, but what we know is that in Dallas, Texas, an ICE facility, an Immigrations and Customs Enforcement facility, was opened fire upon by a violent left-wing extremist, a person who wrote anti-ICE messaging on their bullets, and there's some evidence that we have that's not yet public, but we know this person was politically motivated. They were politically motivated to go after law enforcement. They were politically motivated to go after people who are enforcing our border. I think that is the most disgusting thing. The very people who keep us safe, honored, and protected, and praised by Democrats and alike, it is time to stop the rhetorical assault on law enforcement. Because here's what happens. Because here's what happens when Democrats, like Gavin Newsom did, say that these people are part of an authoritarian government. when the left-wing media lies about what they're doing, when they lie about who they're arresting, when they lie about the actual job of law enforcement, what they're doing is encouraging crazy people to go and commit violence. You know, when I was in the Senate, there was a big bill that was going around, and it was basically that we were going to try to eliminate qualified immunity from police officers, one of the most disgraceful and worst ideas that I've ever seen. In other words, that we were going to make it easy for criminals to sue police officers for doing their job. Now, does anybody think, when you see the fake news media and the way they attack our police officers, does anybody think that we need to make it harder for our police to do their job? Some of America's cities today have worse murder rates than the very worst third world cities all over the world. That's not a joke. You go to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, or you go to some of the poorest countries all over the world, even those countries have a better murder rate than Washington, D.C. or some of the major American cities. Some of them have better murder rates than Charlotte, North Carolina. That's a disgrace. Look, I was asked earlier today by a reporter I actually like, but a reporter who said, well, don't both sides have crazy people? And of course, obviously, country of 330 million people, of course, both sides have crazy people. But if you look at the political violence in our country over the last couple of months, the last couple of years, it is not a both sides problem. It is primarily on one side of the political aisle. So, if we are going to truly go after the political violence in this country, we need the Democratic leadership of Washington, D.C. to look in the mirror. We need them to renounce all political violence. When a poor kid like Charlie Kirk is gunned down in cold blood, we need them to start with condemning the violence instead of condemning something that Charlie Kirk said that they disagreed with. When you have an entire network of left-wing organizations that encourage, that promote, and that apologize for violence, you know what you're going to get out of it? You're going to get political violence. And that's something we've gotten away from, because a lot of the people who report on the news, a lot of the people who actually make policy in Washington, D.C., let's be honest, they are wealthy people who can block themselves off from the consequences of the policies they impose on the rest of us. Now maybe they've never had to call a police officer because they can call a private security guard. Maybe they've never had their home broken into because they live behind a gated community. Maybe they don't have to worry about walking down the streets of a city safely because they've got a driver in a big fancy car who can take them from point A to point B, but that is not true of the gross majority of our citizens. So I want to tell you, when I talk about protecting the American dream, when President Trump talks about fighting for the American dream, at the very top of that list is fighting for your ability, whether you're rich or poor, to be safe in the home that you love, and to demand that when you have a violent criminal who goes in, the person stays there and doesn't get a slap on the wrist and released to commit more crime in the community. That's what we want. We don't want a criminal justice system that goes after innocent people. We also don't want a criminal justice system that lets obviously violent felons out of prison without any real consequences. It's just very simple. And again, I go back to the statistic where we have got such a small number of people who commit so much of the violent crime. If we just locked them up, and I mean, look, I believe in repentance and I believe in forgiveness, but I believe that forgiveness often only comes on the other side of real punishment and real regret, which is why we got to lock some of these guys up in the first place. So yeah, I blame the political leadership, and I can't get over a governor who pursued soft-on-crime policies, Roy Cooper, who pursued soft-on-crime policies, who let violent criminals out of prison, and then after Irina was murdered, to have the audacity to blame our law enforcement. Law enforcement arrested this guy 14 times. They did their job. It's time for the politicians to do their job too. Well, look, if the mayor of Charlotte and the governor of North Carolina asked for our help, we would absolutely send it because we believe in helping people regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans. We would love to have the mayor of Charlotte reach out for our help, and you asked what the metrics are. That's one of the most important metrics. We want to go where we can have a real partnership between local law enforcement and the federal officials so that we can root out the crime. And that goes to the second metric. What is the most important thing? You can tell how many people are being murdered in a community. You can tell how many carjackings there are. You can tell how many armed robberies there are. There's way too much violent crime happening in our country. And when we look at an American community, again, we don't care about their politics. When we look at an American community where people are suffering because of violent crime, our response is, we want to help, just let us. And I'd encourage everybody to talk to your local officials. I know we're a little far away from Charlotte, but to talk to your local officials and encourage them to ask for the help of the Trump administration. We are willing to provide it. We want fewer people to be affected by violent crime, but these guys have actually got to play a partnership role with us. And unfortunately, way too many of them. Some of these people, it's crazy. They are ruling over cities that have violent crime rates that are worse than Mogadishu, and they say, no, 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 we don't want Donald Trump to come in. Well, excuse me, if you don't need the federal help, then why is your murder rate so terrible in the first place? You do need the help, you just need to admit it. Now to Ukraine. Look, I've answered a version of this question probably 100 times over the past 3 months, and one of the things I'll say about the president is that he is responsive to the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that, number one, we have engaged in incredibly good faith negotiations with both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and I believe the president is growing incredibly impatient with the Russians right now because he doesn't feel like they're putting enough on the table to end the war. That's number one. Number two, the president has grown very confident that this war is bad for Russia. You hear me say this all the time. You hear the president say this all the time. The war is bad for Russia. It's bad for Ukraine. It's bad for America. We want the killing to stop. That remains the president's position. But the president also can look at reality on the ground. He sees the economic numbers that are coming out of Eastern Europe. He sees the number of dead people, both Russians and Ukrainians, that are happening in that war. And the president is telling Vladimir Putin, it is time to stop the killing. He would say that to Zelensky. In fact, has said that to Zelensky. He wants this war to end, and he's doing everything that he can to stop it. But look, if the Russians refuse to negotiate in good faith, I think it's going to be very, very bad for their country. That's what the president made clear. It's not a shift in position. It's an acknowledgement of the reality on the ground.